interested in reading. I don't mind talking about Richard Lynn and talking about the IQ, but I certainly feel just as comfortable talking about Charles Dickens, or what's her name, Lady Jellyby, right? Jellyby. You know, that's a typical sort of, we can say, archetype of modern liberals nowadays. Do you know The Bleak House? Did you read The Bleak House? I'm sorry for jumping from one topic to another. You know, like the Lady Jellyby, or Jellyby. She was fantasizing about vicarious, that's the nice word, vicarious humanism. She was trying to help, that was back in the 19th century, to impoverished and downtrodden people in Africa, while her household was totally in a mess. She didn't pay any attention to her own kids. And this is a typical leftist mindset. They like, you know, philosophizing and talking about multiculturalism. I know it firsthand, ladies and gentlemen. If you want me, I can be very specific. The leftists and liberals, they like talking about multiculturalism, diversity. This is a magic word now, the theology of diversity. But they know very well, I know it firsthand as a former diplomat, where they send their kids to, in which turf they like, you know. All white, possibly Catholic, and they, you know, they live in gated community. You know what gated community? They're full of them now in California, because half of California, well, not half, but now there is the majority of non-European Americans living in California. Lots of quote-unquote rich, wealthy, or even middle-class Americans, at least those who could afford it, who moved up north to Northern California, or even further up to Montana, Dakota, and so on. So this is one thing I've always resented and despised with the leftists. Radical, I want to give you examples. All right. We live in times, of course, we know that these are difficult times for us, for our species, for our gene pool, for our race, if you wish. On the one hand, those feelings of guilt, this is a phenomenon I've been dealing with, and I've been writing about this with lots of footnotes for quite some time. And I would definitely encourage you a little bit to think about those guilt feelings. Where do they come from? That's the first question. It's a rhetorical question. Presumably I may know the answer, and I'll try to answer that. And then, of course, we have, on the other hand, you have to look at the feelings of victimhood or victimology among some tribes, among some peoples. Okay, let me give you a graphic social environment, so probably it might be easier for me and for you to understand and for me to continue and to follow up. By and large, those guilt feelings that we now all live with, that have been ingrained, that have been, so to speak, implanted into our, not just into our mind, but also into our language. We have to avoid using affirmative sentences in the English language. Instead, you use conditional sentences. Could be, would be, should be. You know, you have to use that because you have to have the window of opportunity, because otherwise you lose your tenure. You notice that in the UK, you notice that in America. Like, for instance, the imagery that was created nowadays in the United States of America, similar to the UK, is of the anti-Indian past. White people, white students, at least my former students back in the 90s, they lived with that imagery that white people are bad because they had real, or for not real reasons, they had slaughtered Indians. And they had to live with that type of a negative memory, negative identity, if I can put it that way, and they still do. Hence the reason you have the rise of affirmative action and negative discrimination. So I'm not joking at all, despite my different antipodes of the world. So those guilt feelings, once again, ladies and gentlemen, they can be directly traced to the end of the Second World War. End of the Second World War, it was the major watershed, as I said, not just for the Germans. Of course, Germans bore the brunt of it. You know what happened with their education. I wrote a book in Homo Americanus. There is a chapter devoted to the brainwashing of the Germans, which didn't actually start with the Nuremberg trials. It started in higher education. Keep that in mind. I'm providing some empirical evidence for it. What the English troops and the American troops, and later on, you know, the Frankfurt School was behind, some big Jewish figures as well. How, in fact, they thoroughly cleansed the higher education, first high schools and then universities in the United States. In Germany was totally defeated. Some of the best lawyers were certainly no Nazis or some man-eaters or cannibals, but they just lost their positions, their jobs. Subsequently, in the 10 years afterwards, this process began and gained momentum in the UK and France and elsewhere. And then that's the time when when actually we're seeing the rise of what they call the left, the new left, and the Frankfurt School, and all different offshoots, which still run the academia. So despite the fact that this Marxist Freudian, or rather Freudian Marxian mystique, or Freudian Marxian mythology is dead and gone. Okay, nobody reads Marx now, I can tell you that. Nobody reads Freud. I probably read, I was the only, because I like reading what my enemies also say. But nonetheless, in a somewhat different modality, those people are still there. Just check the pedigree and check the background of professors at the University of London or at Berkeley, or for that matter, Brown University in the United States of America. You will know exactly what I'm talking about. So those guilt feelings will be there as long as those people formulate our discourse, as long as they dictate my choice of words, and as long as they, that's a nice word I love, colonize our mindset. And this colonization of mindset comes in our postmodernity directly from where, guess where? It doesn't take much time. From Hollywood, of course, because we're all a little bit tempted by those pictures, not just by nude women, but also, the crazy pictures, and I see that with my son. My son tells me every once, although he knows he's not a stupid guy, he knows that, but tells me, why the heck, Dad, do you have to go to places like that? Those people, this is wasted time, this is a loss of time. But I just do it. I guess I don't want to now brag. I just do it because it's part of my damn destiny, because I have no other choice. So even if all those bridges are dead and gone in front of me, I hope you'll have a chance to get to know me closer. I'll keep fighting, because even if I have to die, I'll die at least with some modicum of dignity. I haven't sold out. I have my specific reasons to talk about those things, and again, I don't want to now start whining and crying, but it's a very damn serious thing that happened to my family, and not just to me, to lots of people, millions of people in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, first after the First World War, during the Bolshevik takeover, and especially in 1945. Again, for obvious and academic reasons, I don't want to go into this anti-Serb type of a discourse. I will say that at the end, why I'm rejecting that type of a nationalism, intra-European nationalism. I'm strongly opposed to it, because it is degenerating, it paralyzes us, and it's actually harmful to our cause. Okay, so this is what I'm certainly very adamant about. But the fact of the matter is that in 1945, in the Croatian troops and the Croatian civilians, who for a variety of geopolitical reasons were the best allies of the National Socialist Germany until 1945, they retreated across Slovenia and they surrendered to the British. I can imagine in Carinthia, Carinthia, Klagenfurt, if you're a little bit familiar, it's further up from Trieste. Trieste is down south on the Adriatic coast. Venice is right here. Take about 100 miles. Airborne, like right there in front of the Alps, in southern Austria. Several 100,000 Croats surrendered. Now, what happened next day? It was the 14th of May, 45. So they were shipped back, to Tito's partisans. What happened to them? Needless to tell you about that. If you want to look at some of the books, I'd be happy to refer you. You can look at Nikola Tolstoy. Nikola Tolstoy, you may be familiar. He wrote about this, The Ministry and the Massacre. What was the role of the communists in the massive killing, literally massive killing fields, and it was a massive slaughter of absolutely unimaginable proportions. Let me just back up a little bit. So when somebody starts blaring and telling me about Srebrenica and what happened nowadays in Serbia or in Kosovo, and when somebody starts telling me how the Serbs are bad guys, I am in defense of the Serbs. Because what happened nowadays is nothing in comparison to what the good allies, communist allies, did to our middle class, to our people in 1945. Now, why I'm telling you that, again, I don't want to make the central piece of this in my expose here. But the fact of the matter is that you don't hear about those victimhoods. You don't hear about the victimologies. You never hear about what happened to the Germans in Czechia in 45. You don't hear about what happened to Belarusians. You don't hear about what happened to Cossacks. You don't hear about what happened to even to many Italians. You don't probably know, I wrote about this extensively, what happened to French intellectuals who, for a variety of reasons, not many, they were not party members. Some of them were Vichy's, of course, they had certain sympathy for for the Vichy regime during the quote-unquote occupation of France during the Second World War, but many of them were really top-notch poets, intellectuals, and they disappeared from the radar screen. The rough number, about 20 of them got killed, you know, journalists also, but the great number of them, hundreds of them, simply were removed from school curriculum, to the extent that after the Second World War, on the purely intellectual level, you didn't have a chance. When I studied the French language in high school and later on also, and we didn't have a chance to study, let's say, well, I can say Chesterton or Hilaire Belloc. No, they didn't give us that stuff, you know. They gave us the other stuff. They gave us more Marxist stuff to read, okay? I wish we had a chance to read Lothrop Stoddard or let's say Richard Lynn. No, this was no way Jose. In a communist universe, or for that matter now in the liberal universe, you don't have access to that type of a literature. You don't have, to the extent that the assumption has been created that all nationalists, all racialists are just weird people, half intelligent, with a low IQ, and who are just killing each other, who are drinking beer, and who are tattooing their butts, and you know, that's the image. To some extent we're also responsible for it ourselves. But this is part and parcel of a very refined type of a propaganda, or let's call it culture war, Kulturkampf, that was conducted by anti-nationalist globalists after the Second World War in Western Europe, but in a more sort of a salient fashion, in a more barbaric fashion in Eastern Europe, at least until 1990. So again, keep in mind we have two phenomena that you got to understand when we are dealing with nationalism. On the one hand, guilt feelings that paralyze us in our action, in our activism, even minor activism, or passing leaflets or whatever, because you have a guilt feeling that you will be, dubbed racist, a bad guy, that you will probably end up on a, what do you call it, searchlight, or some bad guys, the ADL might mention your name. And on the other hand, our victimhood, which I don't want to commemorate because this would sound almost like a necrophilia, you see. I mean, when somebody commemorates his dead, whatever their number may be, 6 million or 60 million, whatever, when you do it repetitiously, then you start wondering on a purely psychological level, what's going on? What type of a people? Why do they need to commemorate their dead in order to resuscitate their living? It just, on a purely logical level, it doesn't make very, very much sense. But again, I wish somebody could write a piece. There's a couple of books about the slavery, the people from Algeria, the Arabs, they came all the way to Ireland, and they captured many, many white people, and they brought them into slavery. I could tell you firsthand what the Turks did from the 15th century to the 18th century in the Balkans, and how many white people they took into slavery, the best women and the best men and so on and so forth. Even the Janissaries, you may have heard of Janissaries, right? And you may have heard of those, what do they call it, those were the Wordle dervishes and so on. These were mostly white people.